Good morning, everyone. I'll ask you to take your seats, please. It's great to see so many of you here in the Verti Music Hall, and I also want to say a good morning to everyone who's joining us on our live stream as well today for this B7 Summit, which, as you know, is taking place just a week ahead of the G7 Summit, also right here in Germany. Now, the B7, as many of you will know, is made up of the leading business and industry federations from the G7 states. And this summit today couldn't come at a more important time. The war in Ukraine has not only upended decades of peace here in Europe, it has also undermined global security. It has and continues to devastate Ukraine and its people. It has also created a refugee crisis, and it has threatened global food security and put global economies under immense pressure. As a response, we have seen shared values, multilateralism, international cooperation, which is why we are here today. Over the course of this morning, we will be discussing three core topics that are very high on the G7 agenda, and we'll be discussing those through the B7 lens, from the perspective of the B7, through panel discussions with the B7 principals who are here in the room and joining us from afar as well. Now, the topics that we'll be discussing are the geopolitical state of affairs and the role that value-based partnerships can play. We'll also be discussing decarbonization, the decarbonization of industry, and the contribution that climate clubs can make. And as we are still living through a global pandemic, we'll discuss the future of health systems and how we can prepare better for future pandemics as well. And at the end of the morning, we're going to have the B7 principals come up here on stage and sign a joint communique. And together, that will in the afternoon be presented directly to the German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz. But before we begin our discussions with you this morning, I want to invite the president of the BDI, the Federation of German Industries, Professor Siegfried Russwurm, to join us here on stage for some opening words.
Welcome to the B7 Summit. Dear Minister Hott, dear Mr. Rengen, dear B7 Business Association presidents, dear CEOs and business leaders, ladies and gentlemen, all protocol observed. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all for this B7 Summit today. My big thanks go to Deloitte for their generous sponsorship. Without you, such a summit would not be possible. We as BDI, we are honored that the German federal government has mandated us with the presidency of the B7, of course in close cooperation with our colleagues from the BDA, the Confederation of German Employers Association, and the IHK, the Association of German Chambers of Commerce and Industry. With the high level of commitment of our business associations to the B7 process, we are sending two important signals. First, we want to show the high value that we all attach to the rules-based order, which finds itself under massive pressure. Our business community is strongly affected by disruptions. We only have a perspective for prosperity, security, and sustainability through international cooperation. We want to assume this global responsibility together. I would therefore like to thank our international partner associations for their intensive cooperation. We are united by the aspiration to shape the world together. In 6 individual working groups, the B7 Circle has developed concrete policy recommendations for the G7. We have the chance today to discuss excerpts of these topics in 3 different panels, as Sumi just mentioned. Secondly, we want to show the G7 governments that we, the B7, want to work closely together to make globalization a success for the future. Ladies and gentlemen, progress for a fairer world is the motto of the German G7 presidency. Yes, progress is necessary on many levels. It also means getting out of crisis mode, becoming more active framers, making the global order resilient to shocks, ensuring financial solidity, learning from mistakes, and playing more effectively to our own economic strength. The world's open market economies are navigating stormy waters. Free, rules-based global trade has not necessarily produced rapid convergence of social and political systems. For their part, autocrats are using the global value networks for geopolitical goals, and their self-governance has grown to utilize economic dependencies as political pressure. The international order has reached a tipping point. It is clear that many autocrats have decided to go their own way, and as such, we, the B7, as a community of values, must finally take up the reins of action decisively and self-confidently. This global systemic competition harbors enormous potential for tension and even military escalation. Putin has dug a deep hole for his country from which it will be difficult to climb out, and the consequences are fatal. Hard-earned prosperity has been carelessly put at risk in too many places across the world. Prosperity that was often only made possible through globalization. At the same time, our own political capacity to act is under attack. Liberal democracies must unite against this and become more resilient. Together, we must vigorously defend our values. Human dignity, freedom of expression, and self-determination are the essence of our model of life, and they are non-negotiable. The turning point, the Zeitenwende, as it was called by the German Chancellor, is an historic date for our economies. As a consequence, our sensitivity has increased and risks are being reassessed. There is one mistake we must not make: promotion of formations of blocks and disintegration of the global economy by dividing it into ideological camps. This is the greatest threat to our prosperity and the successful transformation to climate neutrality. Worldwide problems such as climate change and pandemics can only be mastered through cooperation across boundaries. Global value creation secures our prosperity and enables us to agree on common standards. Ladies and gentlemen, the continuous crisis mode of the past few years, which began with the financial market crisis in 2008, was intensified in Europe by the sovereign debt crisis and seemed interminable by the once-in-a-century COVID pandemic. All this has challenged and changed the relationship between state and economy in an extraordinary way, and as we see that in all G7 countries. The increasing integration of state, economy, and civil society presents the government of the G7 with a dilemma. The gap between the state's claim to control and the actual ability to control it is widening. As important as coordinated action between the state and the economy is, we need to watch and observe this trend carefully. This applies in particular to the right path in international competition. Isolation and protectionism are expressions of political nostalgia. Only those who face up to competition can win it. Only those who are ruthlessly aware of their own actual impact can recognize opportunities and risks. The G7, which today still accounts for about 45% of global GDP, by the way, compared to the former share of 2/3 in 2006, must offer the world a model of progress and prosperity that is more attractive than the autocratic order. The states beyond G7 make up almost 90% of the world's population. So what's the consequence? We must pursue responsible, strategically oriented cooperation, and we should not rule out cooperation with autocratic systems. Global competitiveness and the opening of markets remain crucial in order to expand our ability to make an impact to the world and make global contributions to global challenges. The geopolitical turning point with the beginning of the war in Ukraine and the experience with the pandemic nurture the idea of deglobalization. However, economic autarky is an illusion. Likewise, the assumption that trade automatically changes political orders to the better is not realistic. If we get this right together and convince more and more partners in the world to trade and collaborate with us, we can achieve prosperity for all partners involved through globalization. This indeed requires a coordinated political agenda, coordinated within the G7 and with the business community of the B7. In my view, 5 points are key. First, we have learned that concentrating strategically important supply networks in just one country leads to risks. We need more strategic sovereignty and inviolability in strategic fields in order to avoid being exploitable and dependent. For example, it was not so much the purchase of gas from Russia that was a mistake for Central Europe, but rather the lack of alternatives and partnerships, both technologically and geographically. Instead of mere bilateral relations leading to different camps and silos, what is needed is a firm political commitment to international cooperation and globalization. This must be about diversification rather than decoupling. The problem was and is not globalization, but rather concentration of risks. Now it's about managing these risks, which means resilience, at least with the same weight in our considerations as efficiency. Our markets must remain fundamentally open and must be able to attract investors worldwide. Again, a decoupling, a disintegration into regional economic blocs would be fatal, and we should not bring this about through our actions. Second, advancing key technologies. We can only survive in this global competition if we safeguard our technical sovereignty. That is the key to our ability to shape the world. Key technologies such as artificial intelligence and semiconductors are fundamental to create the twin transformation that leads to more global competitiveness. Semiconductor technologies in particular depend on globally functioning value-adding networks. In multilateral partnerships with common standards, interdependencies lead to more reliability and lead to risk control. The B7 therefore supports the G7 countries in establishing international cooperation for raw materials, semiconductors, and industrial cloud technology. Crisis resilience and global networking, ladies and gentlemen, are two sides of the same coin. Third aspect, strengthen knowledge exchange and innovation. We can only achieve this technological leadership if we maximize our innovative strength as open market economies and revive cross-border entrepreneurial creativity and risk-taking. However, we only create knowledge exchange and incentives for innovation if intellectual property is protected. Without this, a globally leading vaccine development in record time would have hardly been possible. Having said that, TRIPS waivers for certain technologies and patents, therefore, in my view, lead to a dead-end street. Fourth aspect, new forms of cooperation, strengthening plurilateral fora. It goes without saying that we need a global approach to global problems. The fight against climate change is currently taking a backseat, but every year we spend solely on acute crisis management is a year wasted on our way to drastically reduce the global CO2 emissions. The transatlantic community cannot do it alone. Europe certainly cannot do it on its own. It is therefore wise that the G7 countries want to form a climate club. We as the B7 want to make our contribution to shaping this new form of plurilateral cooperation. But this requires impetus for a level playing field in climate policy among the G7 countries in order to prevent carbon leakage and promote decarbonization. Fifth and final point, coordination of international infrastructure initiatives. Connectivity between economic areas is crucial for successful international cooperation, so that the scenario of bloc formation becomes less likely. Joint infrastructure initiatives can make an important contribution here. Also, in order to finally present an alternative to China's Silk Road or Belt and Road initiative. Infrastructure offers and projects must be strategically coordinated, and it is time that the first concrete, realizable projects will be initiated. There is a need for political action here, and it is also a matter of credibility to translate headlines such as Global Gateway or Build Back Better World into concrete projects. Determined policy in these areas, in close cooperation with business, increases our weight in the systemic competition. We are dealing with heavyweights and must significantly step up our own influence. Through technological leaps, the ramp up of innovation and digital sovereignty, we will be able to shape responsibly globalization. Ladies and gentlemen, only through political reliability can the economy play out its innovative strength, open up new markets, and secure prosperity. There is no alternative to the international division of labor as an economic principle of global trade. The G7 countries are challenged to set a clear framework for the private sector in the new geopolitical area. Dirigist approaches must be clearly rejected. As liberal democracies, we must rely entirely on our free market forces and allow entrepreneurial freedom to flourish as a core component of our societies, of our way of life. We, as the B7, are fully aware of our responsibility in this task. We wish to contribute our competency in finding solutions so that our system model of a democratic market economy can endure. A swan song to globalization would be self-destructive. We want and we can make sure that globalization remains the way of progress and justice. Thank you very much for your attention. And with that, I want to hand over to Punit Ranjan, the global CEO of Deloitte. Again, Deloitte is much more than a sponsor for the BDI for events like these. It is a true global partner. The more I appreciate, Mr. Ranjan, that you have taken the time to talk to us. I know you would have loved to be here. The boundary conditions did not allow that. So thank you for having you with us, at least in this virtual format. The floor is yours.
Good morning. It was great to listen to you, and it is my great pleasure to speak with you today. Thank you for having me. I'm recovering from a bad case of COVID, and I apologize for not being with you in Berlin, though I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you over Zoom. Again, my apologies. What I'm going to take the next 10 minutes to talk about is the inextricable link between society and business. And I think you said this in your talk just now, but I'm going to make the point that one cannot succeed if the other fails. It's abundantly clear that leaders across government, business, and society can accomplish big things together. You just mentioned developing vaccines in record time, that's one example, or coming together to defend against violence and injustice when the will to do so exists. The collaboration across public and private sectors will be key to building back better in the wake of COVID-19, the war in Ukraine, and continued economic disruption. To accelerate progress globally, business must embrace its responsibility to help address some of the toughest challenges the world faces: climate change, equity in multiple forms, economic growth, amongst others. Now, over the next 10 minutes, through examples, I will show you that doing so is not only the right thing to do, rather it is the right business thing to do. It is in our interest to do our part. The question now is, what steps must we take? What steps must business take to contribute to creating a stable, equitable, sustainable world? And where do we start? For business, I believe where we start is with purpose. All businesses should have a reason to exist that goes beyond turning a profit. Nearly a half a century ago, when I left India and went to the United States, the prevailing wisdom was that the business of business is business. I suggest that the business world has been evolving towards a more holistic approach, and the pandemic has only hastened that shift. What do I mean? Take my organization, Deloitte. Deloitte has more than 400,000 professionals around the world. 80% plus are millennials and Gen Zs. When we survey them, which is often, we consistently find that climate change is their number one concern. For 80% of my 400,000 professionals, their number one concern is climate change. This year, Deloitte will recruit 70,000 professionals globally. I speak at college campuses all over the world, and I can tell you that without fail, whether it is in the United States, in Europe, in Asia, I'm asked, what does Deloitte do beyond generating profits? And how are we addressing the climate emergency? Now think about that for a minute. If we, Deloitte, want to hire the very best and brightest and then develop and retain them, we must have a credible response to these questions. So yes, the holistic approach that I mentioned just a minute ago is the right thing to do, but it is also the right business thing to do. And the fact is, business has the skills, resources, and influence to create real lasting societal impact. People know that. Edelman's annual trust barometer tells us that right now people around the world rank business as the most trusted institution in society. As business leaders, we have a responsibility to uphold that trust. That starts with putting purpose at the center of the decisions we make and the actions we take for customers, our people, and the communities that we live and work in. Given the complexity of the issues we now face, society is only going to get us so far without the help of business in developing much needed solutions. And as I alluded to earlier, business can only thrive if society thrives. Now let's take a closer look at some of the big issues. Let's take climate change, for instance. And I think many of these statistics that I'm going to cite are a pretty common knowledge now, but in 2021, the IPCC report released climate projections which the UN Secretary General described as a code red for humanity. Though it's jarring to hear the climate crisis described in that way, it's not surprising. 2021 was a year that brought historic, deadly flooding in Western Europe and China, uncontrolled fires in the Mediterranean and the Western United States, and heat in the Pacific Northwest so extreme it melted cables and buckled roads. I know, I live in the Pacific Northwest in Portland, Oregon. I experienced it firsthand. The report projected such disasters will soon be far more common and severe. And you know this, it will take trillions of dollars every year for the next 30 years to advance the transition from a carbon-based economy to a sustainable one. No government, no NGO can solve this crisis on their own. Business must play a critical role. We can lead the way by developing climate-friendly products and services, requiring suppliers to meet specific sustainability criteria, and ensuring facilities and operations are more resistant to climate impacts. This is an important area of focus for Deloitte. Even during the pandemic, when many businesses were scaling back, we remained steadfast in our commitment to address big societal issues. In fact, it was during the pandemic that we launched our World Climate Strategy, which includes a commitment to achieve net zero by 2030. I believe we will actually achieve net zero before 2030. As part of this effort, we're working to empower and educate our 400,000 professionals to make responsible climate choices through training. We are also engaging our broader ecosystem to create long-term climate solutions, and we will pull every lever we can to lessen our own impact and contribute to creating a sustainable situation for our entire ecosystem of partners. And we're helping our clients and other key stakeholders do the same. Importantly, we're also working collaboratively with governments to solve specific issues that impact climate. An example that I want to share with you is the perennial stubble burning issue in India. If you've been to India in the fall or winter, you experience it firsthand. Every year, northern India is plagued by plumes of smoke as a result of stubble burning, which is when farmers torch their fields at the end of the harvest. In addition to contributing to emissions, stubble burning has created a massive, massive public health crisis, polluting swaths of northern India and endangering the health of hundreds of millions of people. To address this issue, Deloitte is undertaking an effort with the government to reduce the number of stubble burning incidents. The focus is to build an ecosystem of corporate crop residue management solutions that incentivize farmers to limit burning, develop the infrastructure to enable farmers, including, for instance, equipment and storage space, and implement stubble management technology platform. It's a very tangible example of how business can act now at the community level to move the needle on the climate crisis. The ancillary benefit for Deloitte, remember I said it's the right thing to do and also the right business thing to do. The ancillary benefit for Deloitte is engagement where it matters with key policymakers and deep, deep appreciation from our people in India, 90,000 of whom call India home. Let's take globalization. It was mentioned by, in the previous talk. We're increasingly hearing talk of a reversal in the decades-long trend towards globalization. Billions of people have been lifted out of poverty because of globalization, but it has not worked equally well for everyone everywhere. And there is no longer consensus that the path of globalization followed in the last 25 years, with its positive benefits, represents the best way forward. Profound inequities persist both across and within countries. And amid the pandemic, global migration emergencies, and climate change, the gap is only widening. As business leaders, we have a responsibility and a vested interest in addressing the structural flaws and biases perpetuating these disparities. We must ask ourselves not only what we are doing to generate equitable outcomes, but what more we can do. let me share some sobering statistics that greatly impact future equity. 60 million children are out of school, and this problem got a lot worse in the pandemic. 800 million adults are unable to read and write. In India, 175 women and girls cannot read and write. 2 billion jobs are expected to disappear to automation by 2030. This represents an enormous but unskilled talent pipeline. So in response, Deloitte launched World Class, our commitment to improving the lives of 100 million people through education and skill building. The goal will help people prepare for the future of work in line with the UN's SDGs. If more companies were to apply the unique capabilities and expertise of their professionals to supporting talent in marginalized communities, we would have a real shot at turning more of today's students into tomorrow's employees. Health equity is another example. The pandemic didn't just expose the disparities in healthcare, it hit home the tragic outcomes that come of them. Again, another example, with the government of Haryana in India, Deloitte piloted an effort called Expand the Ward that offered a potential remedy to underinvestment in public health infrastructure. The project encompassed 5 key integrated interventions, including a remote command and control center, virtual health capabilities, leveraging 3 tiers of medical infrastructure, and the local ASHA workers, community health workers, an education campaign, and a playbook for replication. At a time when the community was being ravaged by the Delta COVID wave, our efforts helped to bring the local fatality rate down by 50%. The collaboration with the government in India relied on telemedicine, essentially computers and mobile phones, to connect doctors to patients in rural and hard-to-reach communities who would otherwise not be able to access medical care. Our project in India advanced health equity and is now being expanded in other districts across the country. And my hope is that we can continue to leverage digital technologies to create better, more equitable outcomes. That is the power of business, collaboration, and innovation. This year at Davos, there was much discussion about history being at a turning point. I agree with the view. And I see it as a call to action for governments, public policy makers like individuals represented in this room, NGOs, and particularly business leaders. The role we need to play for our people, clients, and communities is changing. As the world evolves, the challenges we face are becoming as complex as they are unpredictable. Working together to develop and scale solutions for addressing climate change, advancing equity, and returning to economic growth, amongst others, we can lead the way in establishing the new normal. This is a decisive decade. If we don't act now, it would be an even greater tragedy than these crises themselves. My hope is that the ideas brought forth during this summit will help to ignite productive and impactful discussions, and that we will take the steps, critical steps, together to address these collective challenges. I'm certainly optimistic. Again, I thank you for giving me this opportunity. I apologize that I couldn't be there in person, but COVID has very unique plans and certainly upended my trip. Thank you again for listening.
Thank you, Mr. Ranjan. We wish you a speedy recovery, of course. And thank you as well to Professor Ruswam for that beginning, those opening words, laying out the framework of what we'll be discussing today. Before we begin with our panels, I just want to remind you that you can actively participate and take part on social media using the hashtag for this event, which is B7GER, for B7 Germany. You'll see it if you can have it up front. So, with that, I'd like to move on to our first discussion. If I may quote Professor Russform himself, he said, "We need a global approach to global problems." And that means a resilient partnership based on values. So I would like to invite the panelists for our first discussion to join me here on stage. Good morning. Hi. Good morning. Please move on down here. Any order you like. Any order you like. You can stand in any order you like. You're welcome to choose. Okay. And then perhaps Mr. Beatty, we can just ask you to take. Okay. So as I mentioned, we're going to be discussing in this panel the geopolitical state of affairs. And I will deliver a brief introduction here of our guests. So you know who we were discussing with Dominik Mütter is the Security Policy Director at the German Federal Foreign Office. We also have Ms. Barbara Beltrame with us. She is the Vice President for International Affairs of Confindustria. We have Mr. Geoffroy Roux de Bézu, the President of MEDEF International. Ichiro Hara is with us as well, the Managing Director of Kidanren. And of course, Perrin Beatty, who I just mentioned, is the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. Good morning to you. Welcome, everyone. I'd like to start with you, Mr. B, for the first question. In the war in Ukraine that we have been discussing is not so far from the stage that we're standing on here in Berlin. What is the perspective in Canada? What role does the war play there?
Let me give a bit of perspective on that.